Hi, everybody. This is App Architecture Q&A number 14, and I'm here with Chris and Matt again. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Hi, Matt.
Hi.
But yeah, I always also forget that you see them in the little thumbnails. When you have a Hangout with 3, you get the little thumbnails. So yeah, so let's get right into it. We don't have many questions for today, so this should be a fairly short Q&A. And I'd say we can start with some simple questions like, for example, Mustafa asked us if there will be a playground version of the book as well. Chris, what do you think?
I don't think so. So
That's short.
We did this for a couple of books we already wrote. So we would generate also a playground version and a playground book. Well, besides all the problems that playgrounds have, like not being stable, they're also not, even for something like functional Swift, they're not really perfect because playgrounds are very linear, and sometimes you want to use code that's not so linear, like you want to define a function a little bit later, and that doesn't really work. For app architecture, I don't think it makes much sense. Almost all of the code we have comes from the different implementations of our project, and we cannot really isolate this to a playground. So we'll just stick with the usual formats. So the Mobi, the EPUB, the PDF, and the paperbook.
And of course, all the code that is available on GitHub then. So all the sample projects are there, but you will have to basically interleave them by yourself. When you read the book, you can have the code next to you and look at it. So then we have a question that came up in the GitHub discussions about using the guard statement and how we use the guard statement. And although this is more of a Swift language kind of question, there's maybe a point there in terms of how does error handling fit into considerations about architecture. Matt, do you have ideas about that?
I mean, yeah, the guard statement is just a good idea to use if your entire function is essentially wrapped in one conditional. But error handling is, in an application, it's mostly about where do errors occur? I mean, normally network or some other backend service. And are you propagating that through your model to somewhere where it can be surfaced to the user interface? But unfortunately, that mostly ends up being a model consideration. It's not really about application architecture. It feels like it should be, but it's mostly, is your model surfacing errors that occur in some service? And then you just have high-level elements of your UI observing, kind of observables that say an error occurred. So you might have a view controller observing, did a network error affecting this view controller occur? And you just have some observable somewhere. It's not very, I don't know, is interesting the right word? It's not much of an application idea. It's just some piece of observable state, and you need to observe it.
Yeah, I want to add that the question itself, I think it's interesting, and it's interesting to talk about how different people use the guard statement differently and about best practices. It just doesn't fit for this specific book, and that's why we mentioned in the GitHub issue that we want to keep the discussion focused on app architecture. I mean, there are so many interesting things we could discuss, but yeah, let's keep it focused.
Okay, so and then we have one more question, and this one is from Doug. And Doug asked about basically using types like UI font or UI color in your model. So if you have to persist this kind of styling information together with other data in your model in order to be able to render your view correctly? Is this a good idea to just use something like UI font or UI color, or should you have your own primitives for that, or like what should you do in a case like that? Chris, do you have ideas about that?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky. So in the book, we mentioned that the model layer should be independent of the application framework. So if you take that literally, it means don't use UI color in your model layer because UI color is part of UIKit. In practice, I don't think it's a big problem. You have to think about what you want to do with that class or with these kind of types in your model layer. If you want to serialize them, do you really want to depend on UIKit serialization or not? For some types, yes. For some types, no. I also don't think it's a good idea to completely reinvent something. So if you use something like attributed strings, do you really want to rebuild all of NS attributed string just to sort of lose the coupling? In some applications, you might want to actually do that because it depends on it, or you want to be cross-platform. In other applications, it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. So it's a little bit of a cop-out maybe, but it depends. And let's see. I had another point, but I already forgot. Matt, what do you think?
I think one of the most important points is normally not to use classes you don't understand really well for the serialization and the back end. So you want to, even if you're using a class like NS attributed string, it's often useful to understand how you've built it up. So it's often more useful to build the spans yourself. I mean, you can use NS attributed string, I believe, serializes to RTF data. So you could just store the RTF data at the back end, but that doesn't really put you in control of it unless you've got your own RTF serialization and manipulation library, in which case, do you even need NS attributed string? So, I mean, I think for some of these things, depending on your use case, you might prefer to just store text and, a few spans and a few, keywords that indicate the markup you want to apply to those spans, and then just build an NS attributed string at deserialization time. That way you kind of, I mean, if you can serialize it and deserialize it, then you're more in control of it and you could swap it out later. You could deserialize to something else if you want to replace NS attributed string. But on a separate point, we were talking about whether or not you can have computed properties in your model that use UIKit objects. So if you could create a UI color-based property, just a computed property from internally stored R, G, and B components. And absolutely, in this case, I don't think there's any issue because that's really just your model providing a service to other parts of your program. So your internal logic isn't necessarily dependent on the behaviors of UI color. And that's really the only significant problem with using something like UIKit in your model. You don't want to be dependent on behaviors of complicated objects that might not be fully defined. So UI color, it can do some strange things associated with color spaces when you associate it with a core graphics context. Are you aware of what those behaviors are? Are you prepared to deal with that unpredictability? Or would you rather just store R, G, and B components and always try to construct a UI color, assuming those RGB components are sRGB, and try and build that color space? You don't want to have to guess at the behavior of a UI color. You'd rather just create it at the last moment and deal with it kind of in a construction fashion rather than an internal logic fashion.
I think a good test for this is when you write a unit test. you quickly see if you're also testing internal behavior of UIKit, or if you need to mock that out or something like that. And then it's probably not such a good idea. If the test stays very simple, which probably when you use UI color, then it should be fine. I think another place where you might cross the boundary between model and application framework is, let's say in your model you use JSON serialization that's built in. Maybe you use the foundation APIs. Should you really do that in your model or not? Well, some people will definitely say no, because it's not, well, the JSON serialization for code is part of the application framework. I don't think it makes sense to be that rigid. I think it helps to think about it, but yeah, don't be too rigid. I think another example is in more functional architectures, like the Elm architecture. It can sometimes be difficult to say that a certain piece of code belongs in the model layer or somewhere else. Is this, like you would ask, is this part of the state? Is this part of the update function? Where does this belong, in which box? And then I think with the functional approaches, I've become more accustomed to not exactly knowing in which box it belongs or which category, but I just know it's separate. It's a separate function or a separate method, and that's good enough for me. So I don't try to classify it. I just try to separate it from the rest. I don't know if that's any helpful. Florian, do you have any thoughts?
I don't know if I have anything to add to this. Maybe just sometimes the namespace prefix can be misleading also, right? So if there's a UI in front of it, doesn't necessarily mean that this fits the criterion of what we mean by you should avoid using depending on the application framework. It really is more a matter of behavior, and if this impacts the behavior of your model layer or not. So yeah, I think you can go very strict on this, or you can be a little bit more loose, or a little bit more pragmatic maybe, or depending on your taste. But I think in terms of being independent of the application framework, the primary thing I think, which is relatively easy to agree on, is to stay away from everything that's involved, or which is involved in this application feedback loop. So all the components that play into that should definitely be not be used or like part of your model layer. And with these more simple types, things get a little bit more complicated, or maybe more a matter of taste. So that was pretty short. These are all the questions we have for today, but we will definitely do one more Q&A next week. So if you have any more questions, send them to us via GitHub or email or Twitter or whatever else, and we'll try our best to answer them next week. And so this might be our last Q&A next week. We are not entirely sure yet, but we will let you know early enough. So thanks, Matt. Thanks, Chris, for being here.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See you next week.